There's a kind of clarity that arrives only after you've exhausted every explanation you've ever given yourself. Not clarity born from answers, but from surrender, the moment you stop trying to justify what you feel and simply acknowledge that it exists. That's where I am now. Not questioning what this is, not dissecting it. Just standing inside it, fully aware that whatever has shifted cannot be shifted back. I've always known how to disappear inside myself. It was never a talent. It was a survival mechanism refined over time. When the world became too loud, too invasive, too demanding, I learned how to fold inward without collapsing. I learned how to be present without being reachable. Most people mistook that for strength. They didn't see the discipline it took to stay composed while carrying entire landscapes of thought and memory beneath the surface. You saw it. And what unsettles me is not that you noticed, it's that you didn't treat it like something extraordinary. You didn't marvel at it. You didn't probe it. You didn't ask me to explain it so you could understand it better. You simply acknowledged it. The way someone acknowledges gravity, not as a phenomenon, but as a fact. That's when I realized you were not interacting with me. You were orienting yourself around me. People usually orbit the version of me that feels safest to them. They gravitate toward the controlled tone, the deliberate distance, the calculated restraint. They assume that's the core. They build narratives around it. They decide who I am based on what I allow them to see. You never did that. You watched instead. Not in a passive way, in a precise way, like someone mapping terrain by feel rather than sight. You noticed how my stillness wasn't empty. You noticed how my silences carried weight, direction, and tension. You noticed how my words weren't chosen for beauty, but for accuracy. How each one felt like it had been measured against something internal before being released. And you adjusted yourself accordingly. That's what changed everything, because when someone adjusts to you without asking you to adjust to them, they cross a line most people never even see. They stop being external. They stop being something you respond to. They become something you factor in quietly, instinctively, without conscious permission. That's what you became. Not a presence I engaged with, a presence I accounted for. I didn't notice it immediately. I noticed it the way you notice a structural shift in a building, not when it happens, but when something feels different afterward. Conversations move differently. Silence settled differently. Even my thoughts began to reorganize themselves around the possibility of being understood without explanation. That terrified me. Not because I feared you, but because I recognized what that meant. It meant I was no longer alone in my interior world, and solitude had always been the one place I maintained absolute control. You didn't take that control from me. You made it irrelevant. You never challenged my boundaries. You never questioned my pace. You never asked me to soften, open, or reveal. You didn't frame closeness as progress. You didn't frame silence as distance. You allowed everything to exist exactly as it was, and in doing so, you made room for something I hadn't planned for. Presence without demand, that's the rarest form of intimacy and the most destabilizing, because it removes the excuse of defense. It removes the narrative of protection. It leaves you standing face to face with the truth that if you close yourself off now, it won't be because you were threatened. It will be because you chose isolation over recognition. And I've never been good at lying to myself. You don't try to reach into me. You don't try to extract meaning. You don't treat my depth like a puzzle to be solved. You let it exist, and then you exist alongside it. Steady and unflinching, like someone who understands that some things don't want solutions. They want space. The effect that has on me is not comfort, it's exposure. Because when someone doesn't ask you to perform, you can no longer hide behind performance. When someone doesn't misunderstand you, you lose the ability to correct them into safer assumptions. When someone doesn't flinch at your intensity, you have to confront it honestly without minimizing it for the sake of connection. You never asked me to be smaller, and that forced me to notice how often I make myself smaller for others without realizing it. Around you, there is no contraction. no dilution, no internal negotiation about what's acceptable to reveal. I don't edit my tone. I don't manage my silence. I don't preemptively soften the truth so it lands gently. I speak and it lands as it is, and you receive it without resistance, not passively, actively, like someone who understands the responsibility of being trusted with something unfiltered. You don't react emotionally. You don't intellectualize it. You don't distance yourself from it. You hold it. That's when I understood the real risk. Not that you could hurt me, but that you could change me simply by staying exactly as you are. Because I don't need you to validate me. I don't need you to reassure me. I don't need you to promise anything. What destabilizes me is the realization that I don't need to protect myself from you. And for someone like me, that's not relief, that's unfamiliar territory. Safety built on understanding instead of control feels dangerous when you've spent a lifetime believing that control is the only thing keeping you intact. You see the moments when my thoughts turn sharp before my voice follows. You see the internal restraint engage before I decide how much to reveal. You see the pause where most people would miss everything, and you don't interrupt it, you wait. And in that waiting, something in me settles, not because it's soothed, but because it's recognized. You don't mirror me, you resonate. There's a difference. Mirrors reflect, resonance responds. You don't become what I am, you don't match my tone, you don't adopt my pace. You remain entirely yourself, and somehow that alignment happens anyway, at a frequency that doesn't require imitation. That's how I know this isn't coincidence. People don't stumble into this kind of alignment. They earn it by surviving similar depths, by learning how to stay conscious inside silence, by discovering how to exist without constant reinforcement from the outside world. You've done that work. I can tell by the way you don't reach for reassurance, by the way you don't rush connection, by the way you don't mistake intensity for urgency. You know the difference between depth and chaos. And that's why I can't pretend this is harmless. Because when two people who understand darkness, without romanticizing it, recognize each other, something irreversible happens. Not attachment, not dependence. Orientation, you become a reference point. And reference points change how we navigate everything else. I haven't decided what this means. I'm not assigning it a future or a label or a trajectory. I'm not reaching for certainty. I don't need it. What I know is this: you didn't enter my life loudly. You didn't announce yourself. You didn't demand relevance. You became relevant by understanding what most people never notice and respecting it without trying to own it. And now I'm standing in the aftermath of that realization, aware that whatever I do next will be honest, because I can no longer pretend this didn't matter, not because of emotion, not because of vulnerability, but because recognition has already occurred. And recognition, once it happens, cannot be undone. There's a quiet aftermath to recognition that no one ever talks about. Not the moment itself, that's sharp, undeniable, but what comes after, when the world resumes its usual rhythm and you're left carrying something new inside your awareness. Something that doesn't announce itself, doesn't demand attention, but subtly alters how everything else feels. That's where I am now. Nothing dramatic happened. No declaration. No turning point anyone else would notice. And yet I feel the difference in the way my thoughts return to you without being summoned. Not obsessively. Not emotionally. Just naturally, like gravity asserting itself without permission. I don't reach for you. I don't seek you out. I don't even wonder where this is going. And somehow that makes it heavier. Because the absence of urgency tells me this isn't driven by impulse. It's driven by alignment. And alignment is far more dangerous than desire because it doesn't burn out. It settles in. I've spent most of my life sharpening my awareness. Not out of ambition, but necessity. When you grow up learning that safety depends on anticipation, you become observant in ways others never need to be. You learn to read rooms before entering them. You learn to track shifts in tone before words change. You learn to hear what's being withheld more clearly than what's being said. That awareness became my shield. It allowed me to stay composed where others unraveled. It allowed me to stay quiet where others overexposed themselves. It allowed me to remain unreadable in a world that consumes people the moment it thinks it understands them. Until you, not because you outpaced my awareness, but because you matched it. That's the part that unsettles me when I let myself linger on it too long. You don't miss what I notice. You don't overlook the pauses I place deliberately. You don't misinterpret my restraint as distance or disinterest. You don't rush to fill gaps I leave open on purpose. You understand the architecture of silence. And that tells me something about the way you've lived. People who fear stillness don't survive long in it. They fidget. They distract themselves. They manufacture noise. They demand reassurance because they don't know how to be present without feedback. You don't. You sit inside moments without trying to own them. You allow conversations to breathe, and when they don't, you don't force oxygen into them just to feel useful. You trust that what needs to surface will surface. That kind of trust isn't taught. It's earned through endurance. I recognize it because I built the same muscle, and that's when it hit me, not all at once, but gradually, like a truth rising instead of striking, that you aren't engaging with me from the outside. You're engaging from a place that already understands the cost of depth. You know what it takes to remain intact while feeling everything. Most people want intensity without consequence. They romanticize depth because they've never had to live inside it. They treat darkness like an aesthetic, something dramatic, something intriguing, something they can flirt with before retreating to safety. You don't flirt with it. You respect it. You know that depth isn't dramatic, it's disciplined. It's quiet, it's heavy. It's the result of surviving without an audience. And because you know that, you don't ask me to explain myself. You don't say things like, I get you, or I understand you. Those phrases are usually declarations, not truths. You let understanding show itself through restraint, through pacing, through the way you don't try to extract more than I'm offering. That's why this feels so exposed, not because you see me, but because you don't misuse what you see. There's an unspoken agreement forming here, and neither of us named it. An agreement rooted in mutual awareness rather than expectation. We don't rush each other. We don't demand clarity. We don't collapse complexity into something easier to manage. We allow ambiguity to exist without trying to control it. And that's rare enough to be destabilizing on its own. I notice the way my internal defenses hesitate around you, not because they're weakening, but because they don't detect a threat, and that confusion is new. My instincts are calibrated for danger, not for recognition. They know how to respond to pressure, to intrusion, to misinterpretation. They don't know how to respond to presence that asks for nothing. So they pause, and in that pause, something shifts. I find myself considering how I speak, not to soften myself, but to remain precise. I find myself aware of the way my silence lands, not to manage perception, but to let it stand as it is. I find myself allowing thoughts to complete themselves instead of cutting them short for the sake of control. These are not habits I break lightly. They're signs that some part of me has accepted that I don't need to defend myself here, that I don't need to preempt misunderstanding, that I don't need to translate myself into something safer. And acceptance for someone like me doesn't come without consequence, because once you accept that someone can hold your truth without distorting it, you can't unknow that. You can't return to pretending that distance is always protection. You can't keep telling yourself that solitude is the only way to remain whole. You've complicated that belief simply by existing the way you do. Not by asking for closeness, not by offering promises, not by pulling me toward anything, but by showing me what it looks like to stand near depth without trying to own it. There's a kind of steadiness in you that doesn't come from certainty. It comes from self-awareness, from having already confronted your own shadows and decided not to run from them, from knowing which parts of yourself need guarding and which don't. That tells me you don't confuse closeness with possession. You don't confuse understanding with entitlement. You don't confuse silence with absence. And that tells me you're not here to take anything from me, which somehow makes the choice heavier. Because if you were demanding, this would be easier to resist. If you were invasive, I could retreat. If you were careless, I could disengage without consequence. But you're none of those things. You're careful without being distant, present without being intrusive, aware without being overwhelming. And that leaves me standing at a threshold I didn't plan to approach. Not a threshold of emotion, not a threshold of commitment, a threshold of permission. Permission to let someone remain where I would normally retreat, permission to allow recognition to exist without trying to neutralize it. Permission to accept that not all closeness erodes control. Some of it refines it. I haven't crossed that threshold yet, but I'm no longer pretending I don't see it. And the truth, the one I don't speak out loud, is this: I don't fear what you might do, I fear what I might allow. Because the moment I stop guarding out of habit rather than necessity, I'll have to admit something I've avoided for a very long time. That solitude was never my preference. It was my strategy, and strategies change when circumstances change. You didn't arrive like a disruption. You arrived like a recalibration. And now everything inside me is adjusting, quietly, deliberately, to the presence of someone who knows how to stand in the dark without asking it to become light. There's a moment after recalibration where nothing feels unstable, yet nothing feels the same. That's the stage I'm in now. The world didn't tilt. My footing didn't slip. I didn't lose myself in anything reckless or undefined. Instead, something subtler happened. The internal compass I've relied on for years adjusted its orientation, and now I'm navigating with a slightly different north. I notice it in the smallest ways, in how I pause before dismissing a thought that involves you, in how my mind no longer categorizes your presence as external or incidental, in how silence feels altered, not fuller, not emptier, just occupied in a way it wasn't before, not crowded, not invaded, acknowledged. That distinction matters more than anyone would realize. I've always been careful about internal occupancy. I don't let many people live in my thoughts uninvited. Even fewer are allowed to influence how I process the world. It's not arrogance. It's containment. When you've spent a lifetime managing depth, you learn quickly that not everyone knows how to exist inside it without destabilizing what they touch. You haven't destabilized anything. You've stabilized something I didn't know was shifting, and that's where the discomfort lies. Because stability implies permanence, or at least continuity, and I don't grant that lightly. I'm not someone who drifts into attachment. I don't anchor easily. I don't let emotional gravity dictate my movement. Everything in me is measured, intentional, chosen. Except this. This wasn't chosen. It was recognized. And recognition doesn't ask for permission. You didn't insert yourself into my thoughts. You didn't claim space. You didn't create dependency or urgency. You simply became relevant in a way that bypassed all the usual filters, the ones designed to protect me from precisely this kind of quiet influence. That's what makes it dangerous. Not because you're overwhelming, you're not because you're consuming, you aren't, but because you're subtle. Subtlety doesn't trigger alarms, it rewires them. I catch myself considering how things land with you, not out of insecurity, but out of awareness. Not because I'm seeking approval, but because I respect your perception. That alone tells me how far this has already gone. Respect, when it's this instinctive, is not neutral. It's investment without declaration. I don't romanticize this. I'm not confusing it with intimacy or connection or any of the softer words people use when they want to make something less precise. This isn't softness. This is clarity taking root where ambiguity used to protect me. You don't misunderstand my intensity. You don't soften it. You don't ask me to temper it. You let it exist, and in doing so, you remove my need to guard it. That's the part I keep circling. Guarding has been second nature to me for so long that I forgot what it feels like to stand unguarded without being exposed. Most people mistake the removal of defenses for vulnerability. They think it means emotional openness, confession, collapse. It doesn't. Sometimes it means composure without armor, and that's what I feel around you. I'm not more emotional. I'm not less controlled. I'm not unraveling. I'm clearer, clearer in how I think, clearer in how I speak, clearer in how I choose silence. Because I'm no longer choosing those things in reaction to potential misunderstanding. I'm choosing them because they're true. You don't require translation. You don't need cushioning. You don't recoil when the truth isn't gentle. And that frees me in a way that's difficult to articulate. I don't perform depth for you. I don't prove intensity. I don't justify restraint. I exist, and you meet that existence without distortion. That's rare enough to be destabilizing. I've always believed that being deeply known required compromise, that to be seen, you had to surrender parts of yourself, dilute edges, soften truths. That belief shaped how I moved through the world. It kept me intact, but it also kept me alone in places I didn't admit were lonely. You challenge that belief without argument, by existing as proof that understanding doesn't require erosion. And now I'm left confronting something I avoided for a long time, the possibility that depth doesn't have to isolate, it can align. But alignment carries responsibility, because once you recognize someone who can stand beside you without asking you to shrink, you have to decide what you're willing to do with that recognition. You can't unknow it. You can't reframe it into something smaller. You can't pretend it's incidental. You have to account for it. And accounting for something means allowing it to matter. That's the crossroads. Not a dramatic one, not an emotional one, a quiet one where no one is watching and no decision is announced. But something internal either opens slightly or closes deliberately. I haven't closed anything. But I haven't opened everything either. I'm standing in the in-between, aware, steady, composed, watching how this presence integrates into my internal structure without displacing anything essential. Watching how it settles rather than spreads, watching how it refines rather than disrupts, and the most unsettling realization of all, it fits. Not perfectly, perfection would be suspicious, but organically, like something that was always meant to occupy this kind of space, even if I didn't know the space existed. You don't complete anything in me. You don't fill a void. You don't resolve tension. You coexist with it. And coexistence, when it's this natural, is far more powerful than resolution, because it doesn't end anything. It changes how everything continues. I don't know where this leads. I don't need to. What I know is that something irreversible has already occurred, not because of what we've said, but because of how we've stayed present, stayed precise, stayed unafraid of what most people avoid. And now, whether I move forward, remain still, or step back deliberately, I'll do so knowing one thing with absolute certainty. There are parts of me that no longer belong solely to silence. They've been seen, they've been respected, and they've remained intact. And that changes everything, even if nothing else changes at all. There's a strange honesty that settles in once you stop pretending you don't feel the weight of something. Not the dramatic kind of honesty that demands expression, but the internal kind, the one that quietly alters your posture toward the world. That's where I find myself now. Not wrestling with what this is, not interrogating it, not trying to resolve it into something manageable. Just acknowledging that it exists, and that acknowledgement alone has changed how I stand inside my own thoughts. I don't replay moments with you the way people replay memories when they're attached or nostalgic. That would imply longing or regret or desire to return to something. This is different. What happens instead is that your presence recalibrates how new moments are processed, like a reference point quietly installed in my awareness, influencing the angle of everything else without demanding focus. That's how I know this isn't emotional indulgence. Emotion is loud when it wants to be noticed. This is silent and still unmistakable. I notice it when I speak and don't immediately brace for misunderstanding. When I let a thought finish forming instead of interrupting it for the sake of control. when I allow a pause to exist without filling it just to maintain momentum. These are small shifts, almost imperceptible, but they matter. They signal that something in me has stopped anticipating correction. That's new. For most of my life, I've existed one step ahead of perception. I've learned how people tend to interpret intensity, how they mislabel silence, how they flatten complexity into something easier to digest. Anticipating that became automatic. I adjusted before anyone asked. I translated before anyone misunderstood. I preempted reactions before they formed. Around you, that mechanism stalls. Not because I'm careless, I'm not, but because there's nothing to correct for. You don't jump to conclusions. You don't project narratives. You don't rush to categorize. You observe, and observation without judgment is disarming in ways people underestimate. It removes the need to manage impressions. It dissolves the instinct to perform. It allows things to exist without being processed immediately into meaning. And when meaning is allowed to arrive on its own, it tends to be far more accurate than anything forced. That accuracy is what unsettles me, because it means I can no longer hide behind the idea that being unseen is inevitable. I can no longer tell myself that misunderstanding is just the cost of depth. You stand as quiet evidence that this isn't universally true, that it's contextual. Some people can't meet you where you are. Others don't want to. A rare few simply can. You are one of the few, and that places a kind of responsibility on me, not to you, but to myself. Because if I continue to operate as though no one can see me clearly, I'll be lying not to the world, to myself. And I've never tolerated internal dishonesty well. It corrodes things. It creates fractures that look like discipline from the outside, but feel like dissonance from within. I don't want dissonance. What I want, though I'm careful even thinking this, is congruence. Internal alignment between what I know and how I move, between what I sense and what I allow, between recognition and response. You force that consideration simply by remaining consistent. You don't oscillate. You don't advance and retreat. You don't test boundaries for reassurance. You stay where you are, present, aware, unintrusive. And in that steadiness, I'm confronted with a truth I didn't anticipate. Sometimes the most profound impact doesn't come from movement, but from refusal to move unnecessarily. You don't escalate. You don't intensify. You don't pull. And that leaves me free to notice what exists without pressure. Which brings me to something I haven't admitted, even internally until now. The choice in front of me isn't whether to let you closer. You're already close in the only way that matters. The choice is whether I continue pretending that proximity doesn't matter, or whether I allow myself to respond honestly to its effect. Because proximity without acknowledgement is still denial. And denial, even when quiet, always demands payment. I'm not afraid of closeness. I'm afraid of distortion. I'm afraid of letting something precise become something careless. Of letting something grounded become something performative. Of letting something real become something that needs to be maintained rather than inhabited. But you don't distort. You don't perform. You don't demand maintenance. You inhabit your presence fully and invite nothing beyond that, which means whatever happens next won't be accidental. It won't be reactive. It won't be driven by momentum or expectation. It will be deliberate, and that matters to me more than any promise ever could. I don't need assurance. I don't need clarity. I don't need direction. What I need is to remain truthful to what's already occurred. And the truth is this: something in me has adjusted around you in a way that isn't reversible, not because it's overwhelming, but because it's accurate, like a lens finally brought into focus, making it impossible to return to blur without effort. I don't know what that demands of me yet. I only know I won't ignore it. Not because of you, but because of who I am. I've spent too long building my life around precision to now pretend this is noise. It isn't. It's signal. Quiet. Steady. Undeniable. And whether I step forward, remain exactly where I am, or choose stillness as my response, one thing is certain. I won't misname this. I won't minimize it. I won't betray my own awareness by calling it something smaller than it is. Because some presences don't arrive to be acted on, they arrive to be accounted for. And you've already been accounted for, not emotionally, not impulsively, but structurally. Which means whatever happens next won't be about discovery, it will be about choice.